If we had to choose the single most defining feature of this recipe, it would undoubtedly be the dough. What truly sets this dough apart is its versatility. It can be baked in your home oven or even cooked on the stovetop, yet still achieve a texture that rivals a pizza made in a dedicated pizza oven. And to top it all off, the dough consists of just flour, water, salt, and yeast. This is the second iteration of my pizza recipe incorporating the Tangzhong method. I've significantly improved it by refining my mixing technique, drawing upon a deeper understanding of how mixing and hydration influence strain hardening in bread dough. Hey, Seraphin here. Growing up, some of my fondest fast food memories revolve around the classic trio: juicy burgers and crispy fries, perfectly fried chicken, and of course, that classic fast food pizza. Here, those three are incredibly popular, and for the longest time as a kid, I thought I knew what the best pizza tasted like. Ha, boy was I wrong. Of course, when I grew up and started exploring more options, authentic pizzas with handcrafted crusts and higher quality cheeses, I realized just how much I'd been missing out on. Not that there's anything wrong with the occasional fast food indulgence, but I realized that the quality of the food is truly intertwined with how it's made. So what constitutes a truly good pizza? We could delve into the details of high-quality toppings such as extra virgin olive oil, fresh mozzarella cheese, rich tomato sauces. However, beyond the allure of these ingredients, crafting the very best pizza necessitates two fundamental elements: a superior dough and the mastery of its handling. The ideal pizza dough exhibits both strength and extensibility, allowing it to be stretched into a thin base without tearing. Furthermore, it must possess a nuanced flavor profile that complements the chosen toppings. While pizza making diverges significantly from bread making, it remains a dynamic process characterized by continuous physicochemical, microbiological, and biochemical transformations. These transformations are driven by the interplay of mechanical thermal action and the activity of yeast, lactic acid bacteria, and endogenous enzymes. As we saw in my previous videos, bread dough strengthens through a process called strain hardening. Of course, from traditional seasoned pizza makers, you might not explicitly hear the term strain hardening. Instead, their explanations often focus on elasticity, extensibility, and other related concepts. These terms essentially describe the various phases of strain hardening, as elaborated in my recent series of videos on the subject. Given that pizza dough shares the same fundamental ingredients as lean bread dough, strain hardening is the cornerstone of its structure. Many of the steps in bread making are designed to strengthen the dough through strain hardening. This is crucial because with bread, we need to develop a strong dough structure with the ability to hold on to the gas produced during fermentation and oven spring. This ability is referred to as the gas retention of the dough, and it plays a crucial role in determining the quality of the final bread. While pizzas don't typically need to rise as high as a loaf of bread, dough strength is still essential. When we stretch the dough out during shaping, the dough needs to be strong enough to be spread into a thin layer without tearing. This requires both proper technique and a strong dough. Additionally, to balance the toppings, we still want the pizza to have a flavorful, airy crust and base, so it does need to have at least some gas retention. Whether you prefer to enjoy an unfolded crispy slice or a bent and dripping pizza slice, a well-aerated base and crust will always provide that delicate texture and enhance the flavor of a good pizza. But hey, making a good dough and learning how to handle it are actually things that we can still reasonably achieve at home. When it comes to baking pizzas, though, professional pizzerias with wood-fired or dedicated pizza ovens have a significant advantage. These ovens can reach temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, while my home oven maxes out at 250 degrees Celsius. This means I have to bake my pizzas for significantly longer, around 10 minutes instead of 2, to achieve a comparable crispiness. Even then, it's difficult to replicate the soft, airy texture of the cornicione, the signature puffy rim of a Neapolitan pizza, which is typically created by baking at a very high temperature for a short time in a stone oven. Furthermore, the crust tends to be thicker than ideal, and it lacks leoparding, the desirable formation of small, evenly distributed black charred spots on the crust, a hallmark of high-temperature baking. While pizza stones can help and dedicated home pizza ovens are an option, these may not be practical for many home kitchens, such as mine. To compensate for these limitations, some home bakers resort to adding sugar to the dough for faster browning or using other ingredients to maintain softness. However, these additions can significantly alter the pizza's flavor, which may or may not be desirable. This is where this paper comes in, proposing the use of gelatinized starch as a solution to these challenges. Gelatinized starch is created by heating wheat flour in excess water at temperatures between 60 and 80 degrees Celsius, causing the starch granules to swell and break down. This is the principle behind the Tangzhong or udani method. While commonly used in Asian bread making to improve softness, the Tangzhong method can also produce crispy pizzas with softer rims and inner crumbs, as explained in the paper. Setting aside some shortcomings, this approach has consistently produced homemade pizzas that rival the texture of pizzeria pizzas, particularly in the crust and the cornicione. I have a video out on that already, so do check it out if you'd like to see that first rendition. But after I released that video, I found there were still some areas that needed improvement. And one of the biggest things I wanted to improve on from the original pizza dough recipe was related to the side effects, you could say, of using Tangzhong or udani. While adding Tangzhong and increasing the water content of the pizza dough to its optimal level did mitigate the side effects of long baking time, that is, the drying of the pizza's crumb, there were a few issues that bothered me. First, as has been mentioned in this thesis, Tangzhong increases the tenacity of the dough, and at the same time, it makes the dough less tolerant to over-kneading. Consequently, a pizza dough with Tangzhong can be hard to stretch sometimes and can be easily torn during stretching. The addition of Tangzhong has also been known to contribute to the lowering of gassing power, gas retention, and specific volume, as mentioned in this paper. While these detrimental effects may not be that serious in pizza making as compared to bread making, they still need to be addressed. To mitigate these issues, we pay more attention to the dough during mixing and kneading. In this recipe, benefiting from a better insight into the strain hardening of wheat dough, which we covered in our previous videos, I'm going to lay out several steps that I've found to take care of these shortcomings pretty effectively, or at least reduce them, partly by strengthening the bread dough. One new approach I'm using is to actually add the water to the dough in parts. So in the original pizza dough recipe, as in most of my bread recipes, I've almost always stuck to a standard way of adding water or other liquids. Just pour all of it in basically at the same time. This is the most convenient way to hydrate your dough, but a recent study made me decide to change my approach. In this paper, researchers were looking at a traditional step in noodle making, where they add the water to the dough in several parts. The researchers wanted to see if this method had any actual effect on the dough, and it actually did. Adding the water in parts rather than adding all of it in at once was found to improve the dough's quality and its water-holding capabilities. The elasticity and the strength of the gluten network were also improved. Specifically, adding the water in 3 parts or in 2 equal parts was found to be best in improving the dough's tensile properties. This study was done for a dough with a pretty low hydration, clearly intended for making noodles. But a more recent paper from 2021 has also investigated the effect of gradual addition of water on whole wheat bread dough. The results of the study indicated relatively similar results, noting significantly improved rheological properties in the bread dough. While the later study didn't find any significant changes in the flavor of the bread, there is no underestimating the benefits of a dough being easier to handle. And I think in pizza, we can say that's a pretty big benefit. Additionally, after trying this method myself, I can subjectively say that I think this method results in a dough that was pretty easy to handle. Before we move on, I'd like to point out that this approach is not the same as the autolyse method in bread making. Autolyse refers to the technique of mixing only flour and water together and letting the mixture rest for a period of time before adding any other ingredients like yeast or salt. In contrast, the method we're using here is an integral part of the kneading process, with all the principal ingredients added during the water addition stage. Now, one more thing that we didn't discuss in our previous video was how the toppings actually influence pizza baking. A study that examined the rim temperature of pizza baking in a wood fire oven revealed that a pizza margherita takes over 100 seconds to reach the same rim temperature as pizzas with no toppings or only tomato puree, which took 80 seconds. This is naturally because the pizza margherita is heavier due to the added weight of mozzarella cheese and other toppings. The heavier the pizza, the more energy is required to heat it up. It's important to note that these pizzas were baked in a wood-fired oven. In a home oven with lower starting temperatures, the effect of heavy toppings on baking time is likely to be even more pronounced. Based on this, a simple strategy is to consider adding the majority of your cheese and other toppings after the pizza base has been partially baked. This approach involves baking a lighter base with tomato puree and olive oil first, then adding cheese and baking for a short period of time to melt and brown it. We will be following this method in the recipe later. Also, to balance the toppings and add a lot more flavor, we're going to use a pre-ferment for our pizza dough. I've made my case for the use of pre-ferments, so I won't go into detail on the science. However, I'd like to address a common comment. If a portion of the flour used for the pre-ferment can contribute so significantly to the bread's flavor, why not use all the flour for the pre-ferment? I believe the problem with this line of thinking stems from a misunderstanding of the fundamental biochemical and microbiological processes involved in bread making. To illustrate this, consider a similar question that follows the same flawed logic. If your lunch today was so delicious, why not continue eating 10 more portions of the same meal in one sitting? Do you see the issue? There's a limit to how much you can consume, and similarly, there are limitations for baker's yeast, even after we account for the reproduction and metabolite production during fermentation. Not only are the benefits we can get from a tiny amount of yeast fermenting all of the flour relatively limited, but it could even be dangerous from a food safety perspective. The minute amount of yeast may slightly raise the acidity, lower the pH of the dough, but it won't be sufficient to prevent other harmful microbes from thriving, and the rest of the nutrients will be readily available for any microbe to consume. In the case of a pre-ferment, when executed correctly, the small amount of yeast incorporated is actually carefully calculated for optimal development. By the time the pre-ferment matures, the yeast population within it will have increased 3 to 4 times its initial amount. This enhanced yeast activity then contributes to optimal dough development when the pre-ferment is incorporated into the final dough. Now, a common retort to this is, but there are traditions of pizza making with fermentation times at room temperature for 12 to 24 hours. This is true, and these facts are undeniable. You might wonder how this is possible. In my opinion, the following 3 main factors play crucial roles: a high salt percentage, a lower dough temperature, and the use of fermentation agents that contain lactic acid bacteria. High levels of salt can also result in a significant amount of yeast death. The glutathione from dead yeast can actually be beneficial for the extensibility of the dough, as explained in our previous videos on strain hardening. As for the lower dough temperature, low temperatures slow down not only yeast activity, but also most microbial activity. And many of the places where dough is fermented for a long period of time, room temperature isn't typically very warm. Finally, we should note that many of these traditions come from recipes using a natural starter with abundant amounts of lactic acid bacteria to prevent the dough from going bad. However, the global health trend is shifting towards lower salt content, and personally, I rarely use that much salt in my bread recipes. I add a bit more to my pizza bases, but it's still below the range that is typically used. As for temperature, I do live in a warm climate, and to be clear, we're not using sourdough for this recipe. Without these factors, high salt, low temperature, and sourdough, I believe long fermentation at room temperature with instant yeast is not advisable. Similar to how leftover foods on the table provide fertile substrates for the growth of pathogens, cross-contamination can be a serious health hazard when foods are left unattended in the danger zone. This has been indicated in numerous studies and official reports. Even if you were to follow these steps, as I've explained in my previous videos on this subject, I do believe you probably won't get the best flavor if instant yeast is what you're using as a leavening agent. you may have better luck with fresh yeast, sourdough, or other natural leavening agents, such as fruit yeast water. With instant yeast, those leftovers, the portions of the nutrients that the instant yeast doesn't get to consume, might end up being consumed by other natural microbes from the environment. These could be beneficial ones if we're lucky, or worse, pathogens, potentially due to contamination. Maybe someday I might make a video on this specific subject, but for this video, this has been a long digression. So with everything that we need to know already on the table, let's get into the recipe. Okay, so here's the pizza we're making today. This recipe makes 4 small pizzas. You can, of course, adjust that. If you'd like to make a larger pizza, just divide the dough into 2 pieces or 3, or you could even skip dividing the dough entirely. In this video, we'll also be showing 2 ways to bake the pizzas, as mentioned, one using the oven and a cast iron pot, and the other using just the stove, a cast iron pot, and a blowtorch. If you have a pizza stone, of course, feel free to use it. Our first step now is to make the Tangzhong and Poolish. As we always say, it is highly recommended to make them the day before you make the bread dough, or in this case, the pizza dough. We start with making the Poolish. We have the flour in a bowl and we are adding the instant yeast to it first. This is done to help the instant yeast survive rehydration, so do follow this step if you're using instant dry yeast. Just mix the two together with a pair of chopsticks and then pour in all of the water. Continue mixing until everything is well combined. A spatula would also work here, but chopsticks are seriously the most convenient tool to use for this step. They're also really easy to clean off, which is a plus. Because of the high hydration, this Poolish shouldn't take too long to mix together. As you can see, it's basically done after a minute of mixing. So clean off the chopsticks, tapping these sticky bits of Poolish back into the bowl, and cover it. We're going to leave this out to ferment for about an hour before letting it rest in the fridge overnight. This is to build a lot of flavor, so this step is highly recommended. Now, since we're done with the Poolish, we're going to make the Tangzhong. Prepare a bowl on top of a scale, then pour in the boiling hot water. And immediately after that, toss in the flour. Mix this with a spatula until it's homogeneous and well combined. The most important step in making Tangzhong is to make sure there's enough heat and water for the starch in the flour to gelatinize. We've made sure that there's enough water by measuring it, so we're more concerned with the heat. We want to make sure to add in the flour while the water is as hot as possible. Once you see all the flour combined into the hot water, it's done. So cover the bowl and let it cool to room temperature before putting it into the fridge. Let it rest overnight, and on the next day, we can start making the pizza dough. Prepare a large mixing bowl. This recipe is done entirely by hand, although don't worry, it doesn't require an extensive amount of kneading. Will be done in around 10 minutes. First off, add all the Tangzhong into the mixing bowl. Then pour in about 3/4 of the water. Roughly about this much, I guess. Break up the Tangzhong into the water. This should take about a minute or 2. You really want to aim at breaking up any lumps in the Tangzhong and try to mix all of the water in. This step is simple but super important. Please make sure to really break up the Tangzhong here with a spatula. Take all the time you need, because if any of these lumps make their way into the main dough, they're a little hard to get rid of. When the Tangzhong has been pretty much mixed into the water and there aren't any lumps, toss in the salt. Mix it in with a spatula, and when it's roughly combined, add all of the flour into the bowl. This is basically our first stage of mixing, so just knead and combine the flour, Tangzhong, and water as best as you can. Give it about 1 to 2 minutes of work. This is how the dough looks after that, and here you want to add in the Poolish along with the remaining water. Combine everything together, kneading the dough or folding the Poolish in as needed. Continue this for about 5 to 6 minutes. The dough will become a bit messy and slippery at the start, but keep going. After about 2 to 3 minutes, it should become a lot better, like this. After this mixing, we still have 2 rounds of stretch and folds in store, so we don't need to aim for complete gluten development here. It's much more about making sure that the dough is well mixed. So once the dough looks like this, cover the bowl and leave it to rest for 20 minutes. Then it's time for the first round of stretch and folds. Prepare a bowl of water by the side to dip your hands into to prevent sticking, and take the cover off of the bowl before pulling one side of the dough up. Repeat this for 3 more times, going around the dough, getting all 4 sides. Cover the bowl again and leave the dough to rest for 20 minutes once more. 2 rounds of stretch and folds, 1 done, 1 more to go. After another 20 minutes have passed, uncover the bowl and repeat the same steps as before. You should notice that the dough is stronger than before and it should look somewhat smoother. The gluten network should be very well developed at this point, and we can make sure of that by doing a very quick window pane test. Look at how well the dough stretches out. You can see light easily through it. That's good. Cover the bowl again now and let the dough ferment for 40 minutes or until it's about double in size. This can vary depending on room temperature, so just keep an eye on the dough. We'll leave them to it, and by the time we come back to the dough, it should be nice and fluffy. To prepare for shaping and getting the dough out, sprinkle some bread flour onto the surface to prevent sticking. And then take out the dough using the scraper to help detach any sticky bits. We want to divide this dough into 4 equal pieces, using a scale to make sure they're all the same size. You don't have to use a scale, you could eyeball it, of course. Then, when all the pieces are equal, we shape them into dough balls. Take 1 piece and pull the edges in, going around it, until it forms a little lump like this. Then pick up the dough and round it into a ball by tucking the sides down into the center. The smooth, taut side of the ball should stay facing up as you do this. Place the dough ball aside and continue with the rest of the dough. This step can somewhat be considered a strengthening step because we do kind of stretch the dough a bit and fold it back in. It's important that you get a pretty taut surface on top of the dough ball. It should be smooth and thin. You'll be able to feel it in your palm. You could also shape the dough ball on the work surface like this. Just make sure the bottom is nice and sealed. When the last dough ball has been made, cover them and then leave them to relax for at least an hour. The dough balls really need the time to relax, otherwise it'll take a lot of effort to stretch them out. Now, this is also when you can store the dough in your fridge if you want. It can keep for a day or 2 at least, so you can have pizza on your own schedule. Here in this video, we're just going to store 2 of the dough balls, more so to prevent them from over-fermenting due to the warm weather. While the dough relaxes, we'll also take some time to preheat the oven to 250 degrees Celsius. And since we're using a cast iron pan, we're preheating that too. Depending on what you have, you can either preheat the oven to its maximum temperature or get a pan ready on the stove. After the dough has fully relaxed and we're ready to cook the pizza, we're ready to shape and assemble our pizzas. Uncover the dough balls, and with a significant amount of flour and or semolina, dust your work surface well before flipping the dough over onto it. Use the flour to coat both sides of the pizza dough and then stretch it out gently using this motion. Use your fingertips to sort of spread the dough out. Leave a bit of the dough around the circumference untouched to serve as the crust. Continue to stretch the dough out with this method. When it's wide enough, you can also use your knuckles to stretch it out by letting it hang from your hands. Usually with bread doughs, we're cautious not to use too much flour to shape the dough because it might get inside the dough and end up giving us a dense bread. But with pizza, at this final stage of shaping, there's no folding going on. What this means is that none of the flour goes into the dough. It remains on the outside, so you can add quite a bit of flour without worrying too much about it. To get a thin crust pizza, you need to stretch the dough out by quite a bit. You should be able to see light through the pizza, like I'm showing you here. If you're having trouble stretching it out, then you can put the dough down for a minute and then come back to stretch it out again. Just remember to work gently on the dough so that it doesn't tear or rip apart. If you want a thicker crust, you don't have to go so thin, although you might need to lengthen the baking time by a little bit. When the dough has been stretched out like this, it's nice and round. Place it onto a pizza peel or a wooden board somewhere that you can slide the pizza off of later. We're using a very conveniently shaped flat pan here, and we'll also dust the bottom with plenty of semolina flour before we put the pizza on top of it to prevent the pizza from sticking to the bottom. If you don't have semolina flour, you could use more bread flour, but you have to be more careful because the dough can get sticky very quickly. With that, we can finally top the pizza. We'll go for a very simple margherita-style pizza here with the tomato sauce that we made, spreading it on the pizza. Okay, now we're going to show you the first method of cooking the pizza using an oven and a cast iron pot. So this is where we're going to stop adding toppings and we're going to bake this pizza for a little bit. Like I said in the opening, this is so that we don't burn the cheese during baking, especially if you're using fresh mozzarella like I've got here. It's such a waste when it dries out or browns too much. This also applies to shredded mozzarella cheese though, and by avoiding the addition of cheese, we allow the pizza to heat up more quickly in the beginning. For the beginning of this method, we are still using the stove to heat the cast iron pan in this video, more out of convenience's sake. If you'd prefer to use the oven for the entire process, you could replicate it by placing the cast iron pot on the bottom rack of your oven on bottom heat at the maximum temperature. Just follow the same steps. Continuing with our method, we bring the pizza to the stove and slide it onto the already preheated cast iron pan. Cover it and let it cook for around 2.5 minutes. Open it up after that. The crust should have sprung up, while the center remains flatter in comparison. Bring the cast iron pan to the oven now. Bake at the top rack, setting the heat to top heat at the maximum temperature. Essentially, you want to broil the top of the pizza. Do this for about 2 to 3 minutes until the pizza crust has started to brown a little before taking the pan out and topping it with the cheese. I'm just breaking the mozzarella into parts here and spreading them out on the pizza. Shredded mozzarella is also really great, especially if you're looking to get a cheese pull. Then for the final touch, drizzle some olive oil on top of everything. Then we place the pizza into the oven again, turning it around so that the pizza bakes evenly. Here you can continue to bake until your preferred level of doneness. It should take about 3 to 4 minutes for the cheese to fully melt, but you can bake for a little longer to let it bubble for a bit. Of course, every oven is different, so make sure to adjust this to your oven and conditions. With that, our first pizzas made with the first method are done. So let's go on and do the second method without an oven, just a pan on the stove and a blowtorch. We'll go back to our assembly of the pizza on the peel, or the flat pan that we're using. With this method, we add the cheese and other toppings from the start. Add everything on now because with the blowtorch, we can really control how much heat the top gets, and we don't have to worry as much about burning the cheese due to this level of control. After the pizza has been topped, slide it into the pan. Now, this is a cast iron pan, again, that we've already heated to around 250 degrees Celsius. Okay, once the pizza is in the pan, turn the heat to medium-low, start the blowtorch, and move it in these circular motions, trying to distribute the heat evenly across the top of the pizza. This is the hardest part of this method because if you stop moving the blowtorch, some parts might start to burn, and this does take a bit of trial and error. I mean, the pizzas always come out tasting amazing, but you have to be careful not to burn one side too much. You want to continue doing this for about 4 minutes or until the pizza has reached your preferred level of doneness. One of the best parts about using Tangzhong is that it does give you a lot of time to figure things out before the pizza becomes too dry, but you also need to heat the pizza dough for a little longer to make sure things are nice and crispy. Of course, adjust this method as needed to suit your conditions. After the pizza looks like this, it is done. And here are our pizzas. Look at the flexibility of the crust, still crisp and thin, but it remains soft at the top and capable of being bent. That's exactly what we were looking for, and a bite of this pizza tastes just like a dream. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and bye!